On June 11th, 2022, Amy Catherine Eskridge died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound at the age of 34. And that's all we know. Or at least, it's all we've been told. Beyond that, public records available on WhitePages show that she was living at an address in Joppa, Alabama, and that this same address is also attributed to her father, retired NASA physicist Richard Eskridge. Beyond that, essentially nothing is known about Amy's final moments or even the years leading up to them. The Twitter/X page for her old business, Holocron, hasn't posted since November 10th, 2018. The page for her final business venture, the Institute for Exotic Science, has been dark since December 2nd of the following year. Her personal Twitter profile no longer exists. She has no LinkedIn profile. Her Facebook posts go silent after March 15th, 2020. Her Instagram is private, and Internet Archive returns no results for any of her social media profiles. What little we can dig up tells us that she was once married, though even with the knowledge of this ex-husband's name and the names of his family members, he seems to be just as much of a ghost as she is. We know that she lived most of her life in the area of Huntsville, Alabama. We know that she claims to have started a PhD program back in 2010, and Facebook comments from her friends seem to confirm this. We know that she mentioned using cannabis to help dull chronic pain. We know that she gave a presentation entitled A Historical Perspective on Anti-Gravity Technology at the December 2018 Huntsville, Alabama L5 meeting. Finally, we know that she was working to grow an organization dedicated to developing consumer products based on space-age technological developments as of February of 2020. What we don't know, because the relevant authorities have refused to speak about it, are the particular details of her death and the investigation which determined that it was self-inflicted. And because of that lack of transparency, people have been rather inclined to ask questions, such as, does Amy's death have anything to do with the disappearances and deaths of these other missing scientists over the last 6 years? Without official answers, we are left with two options. We can accept the narrative that Amy chose to take her own life due to the chronic pain and alleged mental illness from which she suffered, in spite of the fact that she sent text messages to friends telling them that she had no intention of taking her own life, and that if anyone were to claim she did, they were lying. Or we can look deeper into who Amy Eskridge was, unravel the bizarre web of stories which surround her life, work, and death, and determine for ourselves what the truth really is. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. In that intro segment, I could have told you the precise address of Amy and her parents' home. I just withheld the specific details because I'm not trying to dox anyone. The reason I'm bringing it up, however, is that doing so would have been entirely too easy. And I'm not a hacker. I don't have special contacts feeding me information. I just have internet access and the money to spend on sites like WhitePages. But you know who you can't find? Me. Because I've taken steps to remove my sensitive information, like my address, phone number, and so on, from the very same listing sites that I use to track down other people. And that's why today I'm excited to talk to you about this week's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni tracks down and removes your personal data, from basic info like your email address, down to personal details like your number of children, educational background, and even your political affiliations from multiple sites, including online directories, people search sites, and even commercial databases. The process is fully automated for hundreds of known data brokers, which are companies that collect your data from subscription services, social media, and even just mailing lists, and then sell that data elsewhere without your consent. Now, you may be asking why a subscription model, and the answer is simple. Because the internet is forever, data frequently reappears on these sites, so they often need to repeatedly remove it for you. And if you find something their scans missed, you can use their custom removal feature to take down almost anything that's exposed about you online simply by sending them a link. And then your dedicated privacy expert will handle everything else. Basically, you tell Incogni what information you don't want other people to have, and then they go take care of the rest. So if you are ready to take control of your privacy, head to incogni.com/lorelodge and use code LORELODGE to get up to 60% off annual plans today. Depending on who you ask, Amy Eskridge was either a crackpot conspiracy theorist obsessed with anti-gravity technology, or one of the most forward-thinking scientists of her generation. For example, The Atlantic's Daniel Engber wrote in April of 2026 that she was a scientist only in the way that a subway preacher is a theologian. And whatever fame she had derived from her claiming that her father, a former NASA propulsion engineer, had discovered the secret of anti-gravity and that she would soon go public with this world-changing scientific breakthrough. Amy's father, however, does not seem to have shared that sentiment, at least regarding her status as a scientist. Even as he brushed aside claims that Amy's death was the result of some sort of conspiracy or criminal act, he referred to her as such when he said that scientists die also, just like other people. According to Richard, his daughter was a marvelously intelligent person who unfortunately suffered from chronic pain, a statement which suggests that her family believes she could no longer withstand that pain and chose to put an end to her suffering once and for all. According to her obituary, which appears to have been written by the family, the University of Alabama Huntsville graduate was a brilliant mind who held bachelor's degrees in chemistry and biology, had a genius for science, and questioned the conventional wisdom on everything from the universe to the nanoparticles of the atom. An interdisciplinarian master of electrical engineering, chemistry, physics, genetic engineering, and nanotechnology, Amy was best known during her lifetime as the chairwoman and president of the Institute for Exotic Science, perhaps best described as a think tank or venture capital firm for scientists seeking an opportunity to work outside of the rigid structures and limitations of government and academia on projects private industry finds too financially risky for investment. In her own words, the institute was necessary because the government has a high tolerance for risk and has created really advanced stuff that's never been done before, but they keep it to themselves for military applications and don't put it on the marketplace for public benefit. Academia, for its part, has a high tolerance for risk for doing things that have never been done before, but guess what? They ain't got no money. And even if they had money, they don't know how to commercialize. That's a quote, by the way. The last piece of the triad, industry, is most adept at bringing technology to market, but they want to know 110% for sure that their investment is going to have a return, which results in a policy of avoiding risk and thus prevents potentially groundbreaking technologies from coming to fruition. The Institute for Exotic Science, therefore, was created as a fourth way. They would use a mix of grants and private funding to conduct research into many fields at once, no matter the risk, in the hopes that the payoff of those projects which did succeed would cover for the losses of those which did not. Amy explained all of this in further depth in a pair of marketing videos created by New District Media House in February of 2020. The shorter of the two is something of an introductory message to the commercial world, and in particular the Los Angeles marketing scene, describing the Institute as a privately held, for-profit, public benefit corporation and research institution with a focus on aerospace, space sciences, advanced exotic propulsion, metamaterials communications, and other types of space-related and terrestrial technology. She expressed a desire to pair out deep technological expertise with the commercialization expertise present in LA. That 60-second promo reel is short, sweet, and to the point, but it doesn't really explain what the Institute actually does. Thankfully, the second clip, which is nearly 4 minutes long, is more in-depth. Speaking about Huntsville's identity as Rocket City, USA, she says that the city has enjoyed a 75-year history in the space exploration industry as a supplier of technology for rocket propulsion, space station construction, the Hubble Space Telescope, and transportation to Mars and other celestial bodies. All of these advancements, of course, were built upon what she refers to as the Space 1.0 period, in which Galileo and other early astronomers broke open the firmament and began to explore the stars by what means they had available. What followed was a long, slow process of discovery until we finally reached Space 2.0 in the middle of the 20th century. In just 11 years, humanity went from putting the first satellite in space to putting the first man on the moon, in spite of the fact that, as Amy put it, these accomplishments occurred in the government-driven environment of the first space race, where few risks were taken, schedules were relaxed, and mismanagement of funds created stalled progress. That era, she said, is no more. Today, however, is the Space 4.0 era, where Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and other space barons are driving the commercialization of space with emphasis on taking calculated risks where schedules are tight and cost minimization is paramount. Now, it's unclear why she moved from Space 2.0 directly into Space 4.0, but if she's going with the existing terminology, Space 3.0 would be considered the era of space stations, long-term space flight, and space-based technology used for Earthbound purposes. In other words, where we've been for like 30 years. But whatever the reason for the omission, the point is clear. We are now in yet another new era of space-age research, and one in which private investment is finally leading the way. But if that's the case, what role would the Institute serve? Why would scientists not take their ideas to SpaceX, Blue Origin, or Virgin Galactic? As Amy put it, the problem is that the Space Baron's destinations are Earth orbit, the Moon, Mars, the asteroid belts, and beyond. And thus their advancements will continue to be most useful off-planet. If Huntsville is to remain a key player, she argued, it must evolve itself from beyond the old culture and become the leader under the new Space 4.0 rule set. And it would have to do that by bringing new technology to the industry through the adoption of commercial practices which bring direct benefit to consumers and economies here on Earth. Now, it's important to understand that Amy's goal was not to reinvent any wheels. Huntsville's Marshall Space Flight Center and Redstone Arsenal have shelves full of technology that began under the old methods, she explained, but which were abandoned along the way. These technologies are available for those asking, or are in the hands of the many local scientists who partially developed them. In other words, the government is sitting on mountains of research which might have considerable potential for civilian application, but which lack the kind of military usefulness which drives the government to continue spending money on it. By recruiting the scientists who worked on those projects, the Institute hoped to bring those innovations out of the shadows and present them to the open market. Inventor Bill Dent was working on detecting buried explosives on the roadside when the end of the Iraq War caused his project to be canceled, she continued, noting that now at the Institute, he is working to apply the same technology for detection of illicit drugs in sealed ocean-going shipping containers. Simultaneously, the Institute was funding the work of retired NASA scientist Richard Eskridge, again Amy's father, and the co-founder of the Institute, as he worked to apply his thruster technology to meet the requirements of tens of thousands of small satellites that are planned for launch to provide internet service to the developing world. So the purpose of this video that Amy did was threefold. First, it sought to entice scientists dissatisfied with their roles within government, academia, and industry to bring their talents to Huntsville, where they'd be given the opportunity to further mature the technology and take the resulting products to market and spin out companies that create value for the inventors, the Institute, and the global space economy. The first goal here necessitated the second, that being fundraising required to make those things happen. The Institute was, at the time, operating on an initial $555,000 investment, but it was now seeking tens of millions of dollars to expand into permanent facilities, build its inventory of science and technology assets, and produce the leading-edge technologies needed to fully take advantage of the business opportunities produced by their consortium of innovators. But there was, as I said, a third purpose. And it's upon the basis of that third purpose that some people have argued Amy's death was no self-inflicted tragedy. At a glance, it would appear that the questions surrounding the death of Amy Eskridge originated as part of the so-called missing scientist conspiracy theory, which erupted in April of 2026 following the disappearances of retired Air Force General William McCasland and Jet Propulsion Laboratory affiliated metallurgist Monica Reza. The vast majority of discussions about Amy appeared after that story coalesced, and that can probably be attributed to claims made by a man named Frank Milburn during an interview with News Nation's Elizabeth Vargas. In the interview, Milburn, who claims to be a former British intelligence officer, explained that Eskridge believed she had been the victim of directed energy weapons attacks, along with a number of coworkers and friends who were allegedly targeted as well, both with the same weapons and through more physical means. Her coworkers had been attacked, he elaborated. They'd been roofied, they'd been beaten up. In addition, towards the end of the conversation, he claimed that at the time of the attacks, Amy was working on a program for Homeland Security, for which he also participated in online meetings. Allegedly, the goal of the project was to protect subways across the continental United States from chemical, bio, and radiological attack, which opened up a lot of potential threat vectors. Though he didn't provide much beyond those statements during the interview, he did give News Nation screenshots of text conversations regarding Amy's burns. One of those screenshots, this one from an iMessage conversation, shows what appears to be some kind of rash or burn on the tops of Amy's hands, along with text in which she says, "Looks like red gloves," and "I'm so pissed off." Milburn replied, "OMG, I would be pissed too. Somebody should be protecting you." Eskridge responded with another picture showing her hands hovering over her keyboard, and the message is, "Burns line up perfectly with the edge of the table as I was typing, and getting hit repeatedly with military-grade sci-fi weapons is pretty tiresome after a while. Another screenshot, this time taken on an Android phone and using the Signal encrypted messaging app, reads as follows. Bob had it right. McCandlish's fatal mistake was that he did not tell anyone that he was under threat. Bob is alive because he told fucking everyone. I did not kill myself. I did not shoot myself in the head with my own firearm. I did not overdose on my prescription meds. I did not drive off a cliff. Like, even all the way back to the pain raise that we have both experienced for a while now. OMG, not a foreign nation state, and not USG, the contractors. Private contractors hiring other private contractors to pain ray and or harass you to death. Not for national security concerns, but to eliminate or disable potential competition for their multi-billion-dollar contracts. All this harassment we've experienced is just about the money. It's not a very good scenario. There are a couple more messages in that chain, but due to other elements on screen, it's difficult to read them. One at the top reads, investigate Lockheed or Northrop or before being cut off. It's probably Boeing. And the other reads, some assholes before another element blocks out a word, which seems to be before the word outlandish and then bad. Whatever the missing word is, it appears to start with WH. Now, there are a couple of obvious questions about the text messages, the first of them being, could they have been faked? And the answer is yes, they could have been, but then again, they could also be real. The only way to confirm one way or the other would be forensic analysis of the metadata in the images and a search of Milburn's phone, so until someone does that, we can't know for sure. The other question is, why is one of the images from an iPhone and the other from an Android? One explanation is that they could be fake, but you'd have to be pretty stupid to make a mistake like that. The other is that Frank either had two cell phones, not uncommon in many lines of work, or that he got a new phone in the time between the two conversations. The iMessage conversation contains a red stamp for March 1st, 2022, but since there's no date present in any of the Signal messages, we can't say for certain when that was from. Ironically, it's that very date stamp which gives me the most reason for pause on these messages being real, as those usually disappear after the next text message is read, and they only switch to date format after 2 days have passed. This would suggest that Milburn did not reply to the second set of iMessages for at least 2 days before taking the screenshot, or that they're fake, or that I'm misremembering how iMessage worked in 2022. But now for the bigger question. Can we trust Frank Milburn? It's hard to verify Milburn's intelligence credentials, but in attempting to verify them, I did learn that April of 2026 was not the first time he referred to Amy's death as suspicious. Back in 2024, Milburn is cited as a source in a document derived from a congressional hearing entitled "The United States Department of Defense and the Intelligence Community are withholding information about anomalous phenomena from Congress." Included amongst the items presented by journalist and author Michael Schellenberger in the 212-page document are 3 mentions of Milburn's name, the first of which labels him as a former UK national security expert. The second calls him a retired UK intelligence officer, and the third a former UK intelligence officer. The only direct source for these titles appears to be a guest spot on the UFO podcast. In that specific episode that is cited as the source of this title, which is dated to September 27th, 2022, but labeled as October 7th, 2022 in the document, Milburn reportedly said that directed energy weapons have been used against scientists working on the UAP issue, that a UK paramilitary group has handled UAP crash retrievals in the past, and that the Department of Energy have hidden programs working on UAP technology. One of the scientists he's referring to there is Dr. Amy Eskridge, the 35-year-old scientist and co-founder of the Institute for Exotic Science in Huntsville, per another entry in the congressional testimony documents. And I do want to quickly clarify that Amy Eskridge did not have a doctorate. That being said, I did not see her refer to herself as Dr. Amy Eskridge at any point. Anyway, according to this version of Milburn's story, she was targeted with directed energy weapons and murdered by a private aerospace company in the US because she was involved in the UAP conversation and working on advanced propulsion. In addition, Schellenberger's document claims that in 2020, Eskridge stated she was planning to present novel foundational work regarding anti-gravity, but needed approval from NASA. In 2018, Amy and her father Richard Eskridge gave a talk on behalf of their companies, Holocron Engineering, a gravity modification R&D company, and the Institute, in which they discuss historical and current means of anti-gravity experiments and modern black projects allegedly developing triangle anti-gravity craft like the TR-3B. This in particular interests me because it shows that just 4 years before her death, her very legitimate NASA scientist father was working closely with her on projects related to anti-gravity. And this, as you may have guessed, was the third purpose I mentioned for that video. When Amy put together those two promo videos, there was only one real goal behind them: disclosure. Not surrounding space aliens or even necessarily UAPs, but rather the existence of anti-gravity technology and, perhaps more importantly, the attempts to hide the multiple, yes, multiple cover-ups undertaken to prevent the world from finding out about it. And unlike the story shared by Milburn, this claim about disclosure being the ultimate goal of the Institute did not come from an unverifiable outside source. It came from Amy herself. "I started the Institute for one reason," she told Mark Sokol and Jeremy Riss during a May 20th, 2020 Zoom call. "I started it as a public-facing persona to disclose anti-gravity technology." Before you scoff, I just want to reiterate a few things. Though many people covering this story have framed Amy as a fringe scientist or anti-gravity enthusiast, the fact of the matter appears to be that she was indeed a real scientist with real credentials. As previously mentioned, her obituary describes her as a double major in chemistry and biology, who became an interdisciplinarian and a master of electrical engineering, chemistry, physics, genetic engineering, and nanotechnology. If those things weren't true, I doubt her parents would have approved the obituary. And that's assuming they didn't write it themselves. All of this is left out of most of the discussions I've seen, even though it's a pretty significant stumbling block for any argument that Amy's work wasn't at least couched in proper scientific procedure. Additionally, that initial investment of $555,000, which got the organization running, suggests that someone took her seriously enough to pour $500,000 into it. One could of course argue that this doesn't make the Institute's work or Amy's claims about an anti-gravity breakthrough legitimate, but the names involved do lend at least some credibility to the Institute as a whole. Along with the elder Eskridge, Bill Dent is indeed a real scientist. Specifically, he is a nuclear physicist whose name appears on the NASA website with regard to a paper he wrote for the Marshall Space Flight Center in 1998. So, with all of this in mind, it's more than fair to ask if it's possible that Amy and her team were actually onto something when she passed away, even if Milburn remains a rather dubious source on the matter. Thankfully, though, Milburn actually isn't the only source or even the best one regarding claims about what people were doing to Amy. We don't have to rely on his screenshots of potentially fake conversations or what he said during interviews, because Amy actually did that for us long before anyone in the broader public knew who she was. In my opinion, the answer to just about any question you could ask regarding Amy Eskridge and her work can be found in that May 20th, 2020 recording. Just not in the ways people might expect. While looking for more info on Amy, I came across a video uploaded in 2024 by the channel Jeremy Riss entitled Amy Eskridge Interview, Jeremy Riss and Mark Sokol. And I get the sense it was never supposed to be released in this format to the general public. Though described as an interview in the title, it's better described as a meeting, albeit an informal one. The lack of formality is apparent from the get-go, as something said before the start of the show, or by the silent third member, Jeremy, who claims he failed to capture his own audio while screen recording the Zoom call, prompts Amy to reply, "Yeah, dude, that's cool because that means I can get drunker," which is not the best look for a scientist, but we're all human. She also takes a sip of a Yangling not long after, so we know she had good taste in beer. Anyway, following that little exchange, they dive right into the conversation, with Mark asking less than 30 seconds in if, when disclosure comes around, when the moment comes, are we going live with everyone? Who can we trust? How do we transfer the information? You know, what exactly do we do? As a reminder, disclosure in this case does not refer to aliens, but to anti-gravity technology, which appears to have been the true primary focus of Amy's work. In response, she says that her vision of disclosure involves sending the information to libraries on a certain day, publishing their paper on Internet Archive, and getting it out to the media. Mark follows that up by saying that we need to have a group of all the media vendors that we can possibly control and ask them all to pitch in, give them all the information at once. Seems like a leap to expect Fox News to bow down to a few random people and do whatever they say, but that's actually going to be pretty minor in the grand scheme of things here. As for specific media personalities, Amy's first choice is Tucker Carlson, which would indicate a conservative lean to her politics, but then she mocks the idea of giving it to Rush Limbaugh or Bill O'Reilly, and she goes so far as to say, "F Bill." In 2020, this would have seemed like an odd perspective, but in 2026, it would appear Amy was actually ahead of her time when it came to clocking the significant differences between these commentators, and arguably more importantly, between their primary audiences. For the record, I did eventually find a place where Amy refers to herself as a libertarian, so that tells us more about her politics. Anyway, Mark jumps back in to tell her that their disclosure needs to come out also with all the YouTube channels related to this topic, and that they need to begin networking for that as soon as possible. But why take this approach? It's fair to ask why they don't submit their work to a peer-reviewed journal, which is the standard process for announcing scientific breakthroughs which have strong evidence behind them. But Amy has an answer for that. She couldn't try to push it through the academic system because the peer review committee will laugh you out of there, but they'll send it to all of their friends. While that may come across as a cop-out to avoid criticism from other educated individuals, I would argue that this was more out of concern that her ideas would be stolen and later credited to somebody with a more impressive resume, someone more respected in the field, rather than concern that it wouldn't pass muster on its merits. This is an understandable concern, regardless of whether or not you think Amy was onto something, but it's also not the only one. The bigger reason for this very public release of all of the information was, as she put it, if you stick your neck out in public, at least somebody notices if your head gets chopped off. If you stick your neck out in private, fuck you, they'll bury you, they'll burn down your house while you're sleeping in your bed, and it won't even make the news. According to Amy, she and her colleagues at the Institute, it's unclear exactly who she's referring to, but she uses the word we, have been intentionally below the radar, intentionally like spooky hush-hush. She says that they use heady words on our website, but deliberately don't say directly what we do, and that this, of course, was all part of the plan. First, Amy intended to use the Institute to gain some mainstream credibility and acceptance, along with the required funding, and then use that as a vehicle to push towards disclosure of anti-gravity technology. If she's to be believed, the plan was working a little too well, and they had to shut off their contact form because they were getting too many applications from scientists wanting to come work for her. Now, with all of that in place, she felt they were ready to move on to the next step of the process, which was for her to establish herself as a personality that people have seen before. Before disclosure, they need to have seen me, she says about 4.5 minutes into the episode. People need to be able to go and find references to me online in the 3 months leading up to disclosure. The plan to do that, however, is a little bit difficult to follow. There's really no explanation of how they're going to establish her as a personality before the part where they plan to have Tucker Carlson announce that we've got something big coming. Mark tries to interrupt her several times as she's talking and eventually is able to say that they need to contact Stephen Greer first because he needs to make the documentary. The documentary in question does not appear to be about Amy in particular, but rather Huntsville, Alabama, as a whole. Why? Because Huntsville, Alabama is the biggest fucking deal that you've never heard of, and we need a documentary to drop at the same time that establishes the credibility. In plainer terms, it seems like her idea here is that people are more likely to believe them if they know how much actually goes on in Huntsville. She's probably not wrong to assume they could get the documentary on Netflix, as she states a few minutes prior while talking about her plans to use Tucker as a mouthpiece. This, however, is not the only thing they plan on doing to ensure people take them seriously. My dad is on ResearchGate from years ago, she says. We could post it on his profile with him as the author, and then we could have Tucker Carlson, send in that link. I don't think I need to say much further about the ethics there, though it is possible that Richard Eskridge was on board with all of this. But on the subject of ethics, during this portion of the discussion, Amy displays some disdain for the people who live around Huntsville, referring to them as Alabama podunk redneck motherfuckers who don't know anti-gravity. Charitably, one could argue that the broader point here was probably about how everyone else sees Alabama, and why it's so important to show the rest of the country and the world that Huntsville doesn't fit the stereotype, but it's hard to hear it as anything but elitism, which is one of the reasons I don't think this discussion was ever supposed to be seen in an unedited format. Still, that perceived stereotype about Alabama seems to be why she felt the documentary would be so important. Regardless, the rest of this is an incredibly harebrained scheme with entirely too many moving parts to ever succeed, given the people and platforms she was seeking to involve, considering that Amy later places the disclosure date just 3 months out from this conversation. I don't think Amy had a solid grasp on how long it takes to produce a documentary. 3 months is an incredibly tight turnaround, even for a team that's already put together and prepared to get to work, and laying the groundwork to have people as influential as Tucker Carlson, who was still beholden to Fox News at this time, reporting on it favorably could only happen once there was a documentary for their teams to review. And that's assuming the documentary is just about Huntsville and not the stuff Amy dives into moments later. Do you believe in the secret space program? Amy asks Jeremy, whose presence is just frustrating because we can't hear anything he's saying. In this case, however, we can probably assume that his response was something along the lines of, "The what?" based on how Amy reacts to whatever it is he said. After a moment of fumbling, she explains that she's talking about the military-industrial complex SSP, aka Lockheed Boeing Northrop. We can't hear Jamie's response, obviously, but Amy goes on to explain that she's Googling SDI Reagan right now because she wants to see the year the U.S. launched the Strategic Defense Initiative organization within the U.S. Department of Defense. She proceeds to read the Wikipedia page for the SDI while asking questions like, is this MDA and Amerdeck, Missile Defense Agency, are they in this? Which, you'd think she would know that. Now, MDA is pretty clearly the Missile Defense Agency, while Amerdeck is the Army Aviation and Missile Research Development and Engineering Center, now known as DEVCOM. She goes on to say that the Huntsville area is like, so we have THAAD and CRAM, and Huntsville is the hub of, if a nuclear weapon is coming to the US from Russia, how are we going to see it? Most importantly, how are we going to shoot it down? Her thoughts are pretty scattered, and the only other person talking at this point is inaudible, so it's very difficult to follow what she's trying to say. She also seems to imply that our missile defense systems are centralized, claiming that the radar shit is all run from Huntsville. While Amerdeck is headquartered in Huntsville, THAAD units, to my knowledge, are operated locally, CRAM units are entirely autonomous, and the Missile Defense Agency is headquartered in Virginia. All that aside, it's fairly well known that these organizations are connected to the Strategic Defense Initiative, especially the MDA, which is the direct successor to the SDI. And while Amerdeck DEVCOM is not a direct derivative of the SDI, they do work with MDA, considering they both deal with missiles. So if you're wondering what any of this has to do with the secret space program, unfortunately, that's entirely unclear. Amy doesn't actually explain what the SSP supposedly is. In fact, she never goes into complete detail on that, even though she's the one who brought it up. And it almost seems like she's confusing it with the SDI, but she isn't. It's going to come back later after some further exposition. That exposition revolves around the alleged friendship between Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, whose work formed part of the basis for the SDI, and nuclear physicist Bill Dent. Amy claims that Bill and Ted had some excellent adventures. What she actually says is that they were best friends, though she doesn't provide any evidence for that claim. And while it's certainly possible that they had a personal relationship, I've been unable to find anything which indicates that to be the case. Similarly, Amy's claim that Bill Dent basically helped invent the hydrogen bomb lacks support. To go a step further, it lacks rationality. Bill Dent is not a very well-documented man, but what little information I could dig up presents a serious timeline issue. You see, Bill serves as an advisor to Near Star Fusion, whose biography about him describes him as having over 50 years' experience, and a 2018 article from Breaking Defense states that he worked on the Safeguard program as a young Army officer. Safeguard operated between 1969 and 1976, so we can assume that Dent was likely born sometime in the latter half of the 1940s, or even the early 1950s. The problem here is that the hydrogen bomb was first tested in 1952, when Dent would have been a child. And if the census record I found is him, then he was just 3 years old at the time. So, put simply, it is unfathomably unlikely that he had anything to do with the creation of the H-bomb. Though Amy acknowledges that Bill Dent isn't listed anywhere in the Wikipedia article about the SDI, she insists that when I look at this wiki about SDI, I see Bill Dent all over this. In all fairness, he very well may have been involved given his work with Safeguard, but what really strikes me about this entire tangent is that Amy seems to be completely unfamiliar with the material and events she's describing. Despite this, she goes on to say that she thinks Bill Dent is a CIA SRI plant. How does she justify this? Well, Ed Teller was big on UFOs, but when she asked Dent what he thought about UFOs, he told her he didn't have any opinions on the matter. And because Teller and Dent were best friends, it's unthinkable that Dent wouldn't have any opinions on UFOs, and therefore he must be a CIA plant. Leaving aside the complete lack of evidence that Teller and Dent were friends, I'm not saying there's no evidence out there, I'm just saying if there is, I couldn't find it, and Amy doesn't provide any. I have absolutely no idea where Amy is coming up with the idea that Teller was, and I quote, big on UFOs. Let alone that he was so interested in them that you can't be Ed Teller's best friend in reality and not be into UFOs, as she put it. I found just 2 examples of Ed Teller expressing an opinion on UFOs, and both were rather dismissive. In 1949, Teller took part in a conference at Los Alamos, potentially the same one which produced the famous Fermi paradox, in which he stated that the UFOs they were discussing ought to be a material body and might be an electron phenomenon. In other words, he didn't think they were dense physical objects, and least of all, air or spacecraft. The other publicly available statement, which comes from a 1966 interview in the newspaper, has him being even less committed to any particular explanation, describing the UFOs only as miracles. Asked about his thoughts on a wave of sightings in Michigan, he said that the human soul needs miracles, and in a scientific age, what is more proper than that the miracles should be scientific miracles? As for who was responsible for these miracles, he said, how do I know? While far from a straight answer, it's also far from confirmation that Teller was particularly obsessed with the topic, which isn't surprising because it appears that most of the claims about Teller's interest in UFOs come from unsubstantiated anecdotes related by others. All of that being said, there is more to Amy's belief that Bill is a spy, though it comes much later in the episode. While explaining that she was homeschooled through this group called Covenant Christian Academy during a time when the family lived in the middle of nowhere, Alabama, she says that she lived next door to Bill Dent's parents. His parents live next door to us in the middle of fucking nowhere, she continues, and he's the inventor of the neutron bomb, the best friend of Ed Teller, and he's assigned to my team randomly. I didn't look for him, he joined my team randomly. Why did he live next door to me 25 years ago? That's weird. Is it though? Is it really? Leaving aside the aforementioned issues with Amy's claims about Dent's career history and his alleged friendship with Teller, this is just really poor logical reasoning. First off, Amy was born in 1987, when Bill would have been well into his 30s or 40s. Her parents moved the family out of the city when she was in first grade, when Bill was likely in his 40s or 50s. So chances are that he wasn't living with his parents. Second, he wasn't assigned to Amy's team randomly. He applied to join her organization, and she admitted him into it. Even if we acknowledge her subtle backtrack and analyze the statement that he joined her team randomly, it's still not random, considering she was actively recruiting people in his field, and he was nearing retirement age. In fact, he's got to be in his 70s or early 80s by this point. So with all of that in mind, the only weird thing here is that Amy's parents moved in next to Bill's parents when she was in elementary school, which, isn't weird. She also makes a rather bizarre claim about one of the other homeschool dads involved in the group, Sean Bellina, who she claims was raised on LSD from the age of 6 by parents who were both OBGYNs for MKUltra. I found absolutely nothing about this guy from before Amy's story went viral, so do with that what you will. The point I'm trying to make is that Amy describes Covenant Christian Academy as though it were some sort of cover program, she does use the term cover up by the way, or like cover program, designed to harvest the potential of children whose parents were involved in secretive government projects, and that Bill coming to work for her decades later proves she was being monitored from a young age. Now, I decided to take a look into Covenant Christian Academy so I could see what it's all about, because shockingly, I can relate to this story. Like Amy, I attended public school before my parents transitioned me to homeschooling, and I only spent about 2 years doing that before returning to public school, but during that time, I attended a very similar group homeschooling program called Open Connections. If there was any sort of religious affiliation to it, I was too young to be aware, but I do recall there being some interesting characters amongst the parents. However, rather than this being because it was some kind of cult, as Amy seems to imply during this portion of the conversation, I believe this was more the result of the kind of parents who choose to homeschool and the kind of children doing the homeschooling. By nature, parents who choose this form of teaching tend to do so because their trust in the education system, or the government in general, has eroded so deeply that they feel it would be detrimental to their children to continue sending them to a public school. Some parents, like mine did, find the local schools to be inadequate, and either cannot afford private school or don't have access to one. In my case, my mother felt as though I was not being given the opportunities to learn at the pace I was capable of, and private school would have been too expensive for us. Keep in mind that this was back during the era of No Child Left Behind, so that informed the decision quite a bit. But this could very well have been the case with Amy Eskridge. if she was as hyper-intelligent as she claims. At one point in the discussion, she says she can learn any field in 3 months and that she had an internship with a Mardek at age 15. Her parents may have chosen to homeschool because it gave her the best shot at exploring concepts that didn't conform to her grade level. If a 7-year-old is already capable of doing algebra and the local school district doesn't have a way to handle that, homeschooling might be a better option, especially in an organized, community-funded setting. Taking a look at Covenant Christian Academy's website, I believe this is most likely the reason that Richard and Kathy Eskridge opted for that program. Rather than a grade-level based curriculum, they allowed parents to enroll their children on a class-by-class basis, largely irrespective of their age. It's not dissimilar from how college works. I took 400-level history courses as a freshman at Penn State. I also took Algebra 2 for the second time. When all this is taken into account, it appears that Amy's placement in this school was indeed the result of a government program, just not the kind she's implying. It is typically the perceived failure of the government which leads parents to homeschool, so the government program was the schools and they were failing. Now, why did I bother writing all this into the episode? Well, because I find it to be yet another example of misunderstandings and paranoia leading Amy into conclusions which are very unlikely to be true, and that's going to become a lot more prominent as we get deeper into the interview. Before we get into that stuff, though, I want to finish out the conversation about the secret space program. Following a brief discussion of neutron rays, which I understand to be a legitimate yet immature technology, Amy asks our silent contributor, Jeremy, if he's aware that there are 8 forces of nature. I'm honestly getting out of my depth here, but I want to make sure that those of you watching this know what was said. My understanding is that there are 4 known forces of nature, those being gravity, electromagnetism, strong nuclear force, and weak nuclear force. These are probably the ones Jeremy names, but we don't hear him, so I can't say for sure. The 5th, Amy says, is arguably the Higgs force from the Higgs boson. I can't tell you what that could possibly mean, but I don't need to, because as Amy proceeds to say, who the f cares? It is force number 6 that we're hot for, and that force is anti-gravity. That's what Amy's group has a mathematical equation to physically describe, or, in other words, they have the 6th force on lockdown. She does not describe this equation or really anything else about the concept of anti-gravity, like for the rest of the interview. But what about the other 2 forces? The 7th force is basically energy into energy, which she says sounds like a portal. To quote her, if you can energy matter, you can download yourself into a new whatever through a portal. And I don't really know what to do with that. It's getting very Montauk Project. With regard to the 8th force, there is no 8th force. Or perhaps I should say they don't really discuss the 8th force. It might be negative energy, which they mention following the portals thing, but they don't say the words the 8th force at any point. They do use the term Dirac holes and talk about beta decay, squeeze light, and beam splitters, but frankly, I took Algebra 2 twice, so I have no idea what they're talking about, and I don't think I can teach myself enough about physics to explain it in the time I have to finish writing this video. Which, as I'm reading that back, I'm realizing that's kind of, like, I probably should have said the time I had to finish writing this video. This is why I only have a minor in English, not a major. Also, just to drive it home, I took Algebra 2 twice and did worse the second time. Regardless, I'm not the only one who seems confused about this, as Mark tells Jeremy moments later that he doesn't understand the 7th force, and he's still trying to figure out the 6th force. Everyone but Amy seems to be lost on this, which means she's either the smartest person in the room, or she's talking about complete nonsense. It would seem that Mark's opinion is more in line with the former, while Jeremy may be on the opposite side of the spectrum. As Amy steps away to go grab something out of the microwave, specifically steak and mashed potatoes, which is an unhinged thing to put in the microwave, Mark asks Jeremy, is that the smartest person you've ever met in your life? Whatever Jeremy's answer was, Mark did not seem to like it. Kurt, the anti-gravity mood lighting. Thank you. Jeremy, you gotta understand your place over here. You are the entertainment. You're going to be putting together a beautiful piece of content for people to watch. That's your job. Got to be the interviewer. You gotta make it cool. You gotta make it exciting. All we're after is a piece of media. So that means shutting up and letting her talk a little bit more, or interjecting here and there. That's fine. You know, but you gotta think of it from the perspective of what people are watching right now. What are they hearing? You gotta make sure your microphone is set up. She can talk nonstop. There are several degrees of irony here, but I think some of them are worth noting in more detail. The most obvious is that Jeremy is supposed to be the entertainment, and yet he's the only one we can't actually hear. What's more interesting, though, is that Mark's comments imply that this recording, or at least an edited version of it, actually was intended to be released to the public. So why wasn't it? The answer to that question, I believe, can be derived simply by observing the way the conversation progresses from this point on. Early in the recording, Amy brought up the secret space program, only to divert into a discussion of the Strategic Defense Initiative and its affiliated projects. I doubt that was intentional, but it does sort of bury the lead on how out of the box Amy's thinking gets, to put it politely. See, the secret space program is not a catch-all term for classified projects related to space. Rather, it describes an alleged government program in which people are recruited into secret military programs that involve a period of service, often 20 years, on planets other than Earth, after which they are returned to the point in time at which they were recruited. That is according to Wikipedia, by the way, because Amy didn't give a definition for secret space program, ever. But yes, we are talking about time travel. And yes, that's why I said we're getting into Montauk Project territory, which if you're more curious about all that, we have a video on it. Hopefully it's linked in the description. I'll try to remember. I would genuinely love to sit here and tell you that there is a more charitable interpretation of Amy's position than time travel is real. I would like to say that she was talking about something else, like the Star Wars project or an undisclosed moon base. Unfortunately, I cannot do that, because we soon find out that some of Amy's most important anti-gravity informants are allegedly connected to precisely what I just described. When Amy returns from the kitchen, Mark is in the middle of a sentence in which he states that, according to Amy, Ken Wheeler has real anti-gravity, and he's a honeypot. Amy, who has just admitted to smoking a bowl, responds to this by whispering very sincerely that Ken Wheeler is a honeypot. She then repeats herself more emphatically, and then a third time with what can only be described as glee. Who is Ken Wheeler? From what I can tell, he's a YouTube creator who makes content about metaphysics. He does have some videos discussing anti-gravity, but it's unclear from his actual content how Amy could have concluded that he has real anti-gravity. But thankfully, Amy gives us the answer just moments later. According to her secret space program sources, the NSA has a list of 5 people that have independently discovered what is colloquially but inaccurately called anti-gravity. The primary source that she's referring to here, at least per her description, is a man named Dan Cooper. If Cooper is to be believed, then the first of those people to discover real anti-gravity was Tesla. And no, not the company Tesla, and especially not Elon Musk. It appears that Jeremy must have asked if she was referring to Musk, as Amy says, no, fuck him, fuck Elon. I have a consultant that was his propulsion head, whatever. She also says she'll tell the guys about Elon, but the subject never comes up again. Anyway, in typical fashion of those who want to attach a meaningful name to a rather out there claim about science, Amy's source told her that Nikola Tesla was the first to figure it out. The second was Podletkinov, by which I'm assuming she is referring to Russian engineer Eugene Podkletnov. The third is Ken Wheeler, the fourth is Amy's own father, and the final person, oh so conveniently, is none other than the source himself, Dan Cooper. Interestingly, there is no mention of Ning Lee, who was one of the names mentioned in the missing scientist conspiracy, who did not die under mysterious circumstances whatsoever. We have a video covering that as well. But she was working on anti-gravity right there in Huntsville for most of Amy's life. In fact, Ning Lee was working as a contractor for the US government on anti-gravity, like the whole time. And interestingly, her company dissolved, this is after she had the brain injury, in 2018, which is the same year that Amy's company was founded. Am I saying there's a connection there? No. Do I find that somewhat interesting? Yes. But of course, all of the stuff that Amy is talking about hinges on Dan Cooper being a trustworthy source, which is a tough sell from the moment Amy first describes him as a secret space program, time-traveling, katana-wielding, chess-playing, Japanese, like genetically engineered super soldier who offered to mentor her in chess so that she could solve international disputes through the game. Also, he's not Japanese. He's a white guy. Seemingly somewhat aware of how patently insane it is to trust someone who claims to be a time-traveling super soldier, and the katana really sells it, she clarifies that you can Google him. But ironically, that's not entirely true. I mean, you can Google him, but you're just going to get dozens of results for D.B. Cooper, the man who hijacked a plane, stole 200 grand, and then parachuted out somewhere over Washington. If you do some more digging, though, you'll eventually find the Dan Cooper in question, and suffice to say, I am not convinced. Why, you ask? Well, because his entire story about himself and the secret space program and all that, much like Preston Nichols' conspiracy about the so-called Montauk Project, assumes that the Philadelphia experiment was real, when it most definitively was not. And again, we've got a video on that. In fact, I am going to toot my own horn here and say that we probably have the most extensive, in-depth coverage of both the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project, at least the first book, on YouTube. And I am confident and comfortable saying that because I myself nearly went insane trying to research it. Ethan's right there, he can tell you.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse about this whole thing, relying on the Philadelphia experiment being a real thing that happened, Dan Cooper gets the Philadelphia experiment lore wrong, like aggressively so. And that's not the only problem with Cooper's story, but it's arguably the most prominent one. In general, he makes a lot of rather far-fetched claims, but fails to provide any evidence to support anything he's saying, so taking him at his word would likely be a mistake. And this would all be very silly if not for one troubling detail. According to Amy, Dan was pushing hard for her to move towards disclosure of her father's findings. He said it's been suppressed every single time, Amy explains, but I don't think they're going to suppress it this time. He said, I think you're in the clear. He apparently told Amy that they obviously know about her because she's had multiple both protective and threatening interactions with various agency affiliations. He told her that the secret space program has been monitoring her, waiting on her to publish the research. But on the other side, there's multiple parties looking at each other like, didn't we tell this 3 years ago that we kill people for this? Amy sort of reiterates that same point a few more times, going over the two scenarios floating constantly in her life where she's either the chosen one to disclose or she is a target for shadowy forces beyond the secret space program's control. And then we get to the troubling part of the monologue. Quote, I have like multiple of these whispers in my ears. In a vacuum, this is just a comment about Amy's inner conflict. She could go down in history as the one to expose the government's cover-up of anti-gravity. She could go down in history. She's the chosen one, selected above all others by the most secretive, technologically advanced group of people in the world. But what about the risks? If she doesn't drop it, they may very well kill her or worse. And they're like, because you're a young woman, they're going to rape you before they kill you too, she tells Mark and Jeremy. And I have people digging through my panty drawer, breaking into my apartment, digging through my panty drawer so that I notice I have crazy fucking threats going on right now. Like I said, in a vacuum, that statement about voices whispering to her is just about her inner conflict. Over the course of the next 2.5 hours of the conversation, however, it becomes apparent that this comment does not exist in a vacuum. About 38 minutes into the interview, Amy says that everything came to a head back when she was living with a now ex-boyfriend of 6 months, and that she moved home to live with her parents because people kept breaking into our apartment, and they would only do it when we were gone together in the same vehicle. Not only that, but around this same time, as she explains later in the episode, she and this boyfriend began to believe they were being followed by a man driving a mysterious silver Lexus. I found out that I was being physically surveilled by the following method, Amy says, just under 3 hours into the recording. She recounts how one morning, when she was about to head into work, she asked her boyfriend to take the trash out and use the opportunity to scope out the parking lot to make sure nobody was lying in wait for them to leave. He did as requested, and when he came back inside, he told her that there's this weird Lexus. To be clear, it wasn't the Lexus itself that was weird, but rather where the Lexus was. This is a apartment, she explains. Why is there this really nice Lexus in the parking lot? In addition to being out of place, she noted that it had tinted windows so dark they couldn't possibly be street legal. And still standing by the window, she said out loud that maybe they should walk over and take a picture of the license plate, but that just 2 minutes later, she watched a middle-aged Eastern European-looking motherfucker wearing a black beanie and dressed all in black walk out of the apartment directly across from theirs, carrying a license plate. He opened the trunk of the Lexus and he took out some tools and he changed the license plate right in front of our fucking faces, Amy continues. And then he walked back to his apartment and he put the old license plate on the front patio and went inside. She was convinced that this was a taunt, something to the effect of, it was literally like, come get the license plate, I have more where this came from, come get the license plate. After this incident, Amy believes the Lexus started following her. But every time she saw the car, it had a different license plate. Sometimes it was an Alabama plate, sometimes it was a different state plate. Sometimes it would be random dealer plates, none of which were local, just like cardboard temporary dealer plates, none of which were any local dealers. To make matters more confusing, on one occasion when her boyfriend called her an Uber, she watched that same Lexus pull out from its spot across the parking lot, drive over to their apartment, and say, "Hey, I'm your Uber here to pick you up." I feel like that had to be closer to it. Frighteningly, the license plate on the Lexus corresponded with the one Uber gave her, even though there was no Uber sticker on the car. You can't drive Uber if you don't have an Uber sticker, she explained. Well, technically true, it's not like Uber is even capable of monitoring that without customers notifying them. Now, of course, it wasn't just the Lexus, but also the break-ins. According to Amy, the first time they noticed someone had entered the home while they were away was when they came home to find that the wire of a micro USB charger they'd left plugged in had been cut in half with a knife. She says nothing about how they determined it was a knife that cut the wire rather than scissors, nor does she elaborate on whether or not the door had been locked when they left, or when they got home, or if anything else was taken. But if this was all that happened, it would certainly appear that someone was trying to send a message, vague as it may have been. Now, the story of the second break-in is less coherent, and it has to do with her thinking someone broke in to close their window. According to Amy, her boyfriend had opened their bedroom window because it was a nice summer day in Alabama, but later that night, as they were going to bed, she began to feel cold and asked him to close it. He apparently said he would, but must have only pretended to, because when she woke up in the morning, it was still open. "Motherfucker lied to me," she told Mark and Jeremy, but at that point it was hot, so she left it open and headed out to go to work, only to return an hour later, which is weird, I think that's worth noting, and find that in her absence, someone had closed the window. "Like someone had witnessed that interaction," she continued, "that I asked him to close the window and he didn't, he lied to me, he said he closed it, and whoever this mysterious person was, she believed they must have thought, I'm going to close the window for this girl. And it couldn't have been the boyfriend because he'd been at work when she left and he was still gone when she came back. The third time somebody broke in, the evidence was that a pair of headphones her boyfriend had plugged in were unplugged, and the battery was at the same level it had been when they left, 36%. She took this to mean someone must have come in and unplugged it the moment after they left. Curious as to what else may have been disturbed, she headed into the bedroom, where she found that her panty drawer had been ransacked, and in an apparently methodical way. Most of her underwear were still in the drawer, but the impractical ones, specifically the kind women wear for bridal showers, birthdays, and bachelorette parties, were strewn about the floor. And my fiance informs me that this would likely include lingerie and novelty panties. Now, at this point, Mark interjects that he too has experienced threats, and more concerningly, threats targeted at his daughter. Someone had apparently emailed him with an invite to edit a document called the Falcon Space Camp, similar to the name of a company Mark owns, Falcon Space. When he opened it, he found that it said, basically, kids between the ages of 8 to 11, and Ashura, I guess that's his daughter, is 8, can go on this adventure of a lifetime, millions of years in the future, with the USC Hawkeye. United States, United Space Command probably. Hawkeye time machine, millions of years in the future. He wasn't immediately sure if he should take this as a threat, so he contacted them to ask what was going on, or if they'd made a mistake, because he runs Falcon Space, not the Falcon Space Camp. If there was a response, he didn't say anything about it, and if there was, it didn't put his mind at ease. Basically, people were going to extreme lengths to with me, he continued, but it would also seem possible that he just misconstrued a standard marketing email. Though I was unable to locate a Falcon Space Camp or USC Hawkeye, which makes me think that maybe it was somebody who worked for him that was like, hey, I had this idea for a space camp, because space camps are a thing. Anyway, if it's not that, then honestly, this gives me boomer Trump tweeted to me vibes, but without seeing the document, I can't be sure what's going on here. Amy's only reaction to this, by the way, was to say, that happens, man, I'm sorry. Considering how much she's been going on about her being a target seems a little callous. Jeremy also must be talking a lot during this segment because Amy is just answering periods of silence. But again, it's impossible to tell what they're talking about for certain, and somehow we end up on the subject of UFOs and Amy's experience with people interested in ultra-terrestrials. I was living in Seattle for 3 or 4 years, Amy explains. I was doing the entrepreneur thing. I had like an encryption company where I was like doing encrypted, like end-to-end encrypted file storage for like privacy, security, whatever. This company was likely probably Arkham Storage, which launched in 2017. Around this same time, she said a weird-ass investor poached her dad out of NASA. The guy was from Austin, Texas, because of course he was, and he'd made all of his money doing real estate deals for big companies like GE. This guy, this investor, brings Hal to our house 3 times, she continues, and I believe she's speaking about Hal Putoff, who later in the episode, I didn't end up including this part of the conversation, but later in the episode, she refers to him as like being the bad guy from Doctor Strange. No, Stranger Things. Yeah, Stranger Things. She actually gives like a full list of people that she's just declaring to be evil or CIA plants or time travelers. But anyway, she says that this investor brought Hal to their house 3 times, and she says, I was present for one of the times I happened to be home from Seattle at the same time Hal came over, and I sat with him in my dining room over there at the dining room table, and he was talking about ultra-terrestrials. For context, ultra-terrestrials are a hypothetical category of beings which are technologically advanced to a level we can barely even comprehend. And in this case, they're humans from the future. Specifically, they're humans from 47,000 years in the future, known as P-47s, and from 52,000 years in the future, known as P-52s. Naturally, they're capable of time travel, which is how we know about them in the first place, and both groups came to be following some sort of calamity that wipes out most of everything. One of the groups survives by going underground, while the other somehow stays on the surface and miraculously survives. And honestly, I'd love a sci-fi series based on this premise. So if you've got recommendations for anything similar, please do leave them in the comments. And also, if you've reached the point in the video where you're like, oh, okay, this is a lot of crazy stuff, stay tuned because I am making my way towards a point. And also, we're like 2/3 of the way through, so you might as well stick it out for the long haul. And by the way, if you're like, man, I mean, I do like sticking around for the long haul, but there's all these ads, well, you can subscribe to our Patreon for just $1 a month, or you can get the same over on Pepperbox for $8 a month, but that also gets you access to our exclusive series, American Monsters, which is about serial killers and mass murderers and such. And that is only available on Pepperbox. So, plug out of the way, let's get back to the video. The conversation about ultra-terrestrials is unfortunately cut short when Jeremy has a, just certified Jeremy moment and asks a question we can't hear, which completely changes the subject. But not before he asks Amy if she herself is one such being. I think, based on the context clues. He also appears to have said something about John Keel, which would make sense because he's written about ultra-terrestrials at length. And if you're wondering about his reliability, see our video on Mothman, because he basically invented the entire story as we know it today, with 0 evidence. And in fact, the people who actually reported seeing the Mothman have said he's wrong, and that he lied. It's kind of a running theme at this point. Anyway, you are probably wondering how Amy answered the question about her being an ultra-terrestrial. Unfortunately, her answer is, I don't know. She says she was born in Huntsville, Alabama, in the West Wing of Huntsville Hospital in Madison County, Alabama. On a Saturday around midnight, I was born, she says. I'm a Virgo. She then describes herself as the propulsion princess of Huntsville, which is, of course, the propulsion capital of the world, though I think that Caltech and JPL out in LA would have something to say about that. And anyway, Amy says she was born to the technical lead of the PRL. And that's all we get, which is kind of a non-answer, really. Later in the episode, however, Amy says some things which are a lot less ambiguous. While talking about the concept of 20 backers, which are time-traveling agents of the secret space program who spend 20 years serving before having their memories wiped and being returned to the age they were at enlistment, she says that she has multiple 20 backers that have reached out to me randomly over the internet, whatever, and they all tell the same story. They all thank me for my service, she says. They thank me for my service, dude. They thank me for my service for one specific thing, and it's always the same. They thank me for creating the 3D holographic MedPod. They're like, hey, we're really, really glad that you invented the 3D holographic MedPod. And I'm like, I haven't done that yet. And they're all like, we know. Amy, of course, already knew she was going to build said MedPod, whatever that is, before these people reached out, but she was somewhat disturbed nonetheless. To quote her, I was like, f you, stop with me. This is crazy. Yet, still, they all told the same story, all 4 or 5 of them. Reminder that this is all just her getting emails from 4 or 5 email accounts that certainly can't possibly have all been the same guy. But yeah, she couldn't help but consider the possibility that she was being contacted by genuine time travelers and not, Greg. Like just some dude named Greg, like Galactic Greg. Anyway, this is somehow all connected to the conversation about P-47s and P-52s, which we almost get to have an in-detail conversation about before Jeremy ruins everything yet again by silently interjecting, and by the time Amy is responding, we're talking about something else entirely. Amy very relatably says she doesn't know who Jeremy is talking about, because obviously neither do we. And then Mark interjects saying he's met Michael at AlienCon, and he describes Michael as a historian of the facts who works for Northrop. It's impossible to put together whatever the rest of the conversation is because we can't hear Jeremy, but somehow we end up talking about the pandemic. I have no idea how we got onto the subject of COVID, but Amy says she had it from September of 2019 until January of 2020 because she and her boyfriend kept passing it back and forth to one another, and she only got better when they finally broke up and she moved home with her parents, which means this is the same boyfriend from the break-in stories. Also, this is tangential to the topic at hand, but Amy says that she believes post-corona complications are going to kill more people than the initial infection, and that there would be a wave of deaths caused by said complications 3 to 6 months after infections peaked in March. And this is not what happened, but there was a secondary wave of new infections, so we'll give her half credit. Somehow, though, all of this leads Mark to start talking about a gyroscope, and I'd wager it was to get Amy to stop talking about COVID. It doesn't work, and Amy says she had a beer with a Chinese hacker from Wuhan at the DEF CON hacker convention before Mark finally says, let's not talk about Amy's health, leading us into the next part of the discussion. Now, the new topic looks like it's going to be something called Cicada 3301, but it starts off with Jeremy saying something about a Martin Tamar, which causes Amy to laugh and fall backwards. She's also clearly drunk at this point in the discussion. And then the conversation derails into a completely different topic. When she composes herself, she says she knows Martin and that he's paid by the German Air Force, which has provided him with the most advanced, the best funded, the best equipment, the best money, cash money of any anti-gravity research on the planet. To what end, you ask? To produce null results, of course. In other words, his role is to take a whole bunch of money from the government and make fringe ideas look like they don't actually work, and to do so from a position of immense credibility. Why are the Germans involved? Nazis, probably. Nazi bells and saucers and such. But Amy came to this conclusion after she met Martin at an invite-only conference run by physicist Jim Woodward in Estes Park, Colorado back in 2018, which she attended on the invitation of a Tony Robertson and in the company of a Canadian woman named Chantel, who was the chief research officer of geometric energy in Calgary, Alberta. The conversation derails soon after that, but we come back to it a little later on when Amy tells a story about her and Chantel ambushing Martin at the conference and asking questions about his work. This entire thing is way beyond my pay grade, but maybe one of you will understand it, so here's the full quote. Kurt, the secret space program mood lighting. Thank you. And so Chantel and I, we approached Martin and we're like, hey, Eugene Podletkinov, he uses a bilayer of YBCO. And we were like, dude, Martin, we have your patent. We have your paper right here in our fucking backpack that we're going to pull out and show you to your face. And we're like, Martin, right here in the protocol. It says you used a monolayer, not a bilayer, and you reported no results. And we were like, yo, Martin, how do you expect to get the same results when you use a monolayer and not a bilayer like Eugene did? And then I stood on my soapbox and I was like, hey, Martin, aren't you aware that the most interesting phenomenon in the world happened across gradients, happened across junctures of delta differences? And if you use a monolayer and not a bilayer, that your results might be different, and therefore your null results using a YBCO monolayer are in fact irrelevant to Eugene's results using YBCO. What did Martin say? He said, hey, if you have some samples, send them to me. I'll test them. I have some too. I have no clue what any of that means, but Amy says she chose not to send anything to him because, of course, Tamar is funded by the German Air Force to publish null results. But how did she come to that conclusion? At least in part, it would appear that her reasoning is that Jim Woodward conference invite-only exclusiveship It was basically Jim Woodward's grad students presenting for the Mach effect, and it was. Then it was like Martin Tamar's grad students presenting against the Mach effect, and then it was Spook City. Now, I am no scientist, but I have spent time in academia, and it does not seem weird to me, even as an outsider to the science world, that you'd have two groups of scientists debating a topic at a conference. That is standard procedure for academics and engineers, and even historians, who are debating novel concepts and new evidence. Like, basically any research-based field, you're gonna see conferences where people are arguing for two sides of an issue. It's also abundantly obvious, just on a common sense basis, that any sort of experimental sciences conference is going to have intelligence agencies in attendance. One thing which did catch my eye, though, was that this is also the place where she met Jan Horzan, who she claims tried to get her to sleep with him at the conference and proceeded to contact her every 3 months to ask if she was still single and to hype her up about disclosure. You know, disclosure, queen? Disclosure today? Disclosure today, queen? Queen, are we disclosing today? Are you single, disclosure queen? Now, I wasn't able to find this individual, but it did strike me that Amy's break-in problem could be related to a stalker of a different kind. This is not to say that Jan was stalking her. I have no evidence of that, and I do not want to accuse him of that. Please do not take this as me accusing this guy that I had known nothing about of breaking into her apartment or stalking her. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that an eroto-romantic stalker could be a more reasonable explanation than some sort of veiled threat from people or places unknown. And for that reason, I felt like this would be a good time to go back and take a look at what we've just discussed. Regarding the break-ins, it is entirely possible that these were real, but there are some questions worth asking. For one, why did Amy assume that her boyfriend only pretended to close the window? Considering her reasoning for this accusation is that it was open when she got up in the morning, and the fact that she said her boyfriend was already out of the house by then, is it not possible that he did, in fact, close the window, then opened it up again before she woke up? That would be a perfectly rational explanation for that aspect of the story. So why did she assume he was lying? And I want you to really bury that question in your brain. Why did she assume he was lying? In fact, why did she assume most of the things she assumed here? Now, the bit about the window being closed is a bit more difficult to explain, like when she came back from work and the window was closed. But then again, it's possible that she closed it and forgot about doing so, or that it wasn't open in the first place and in her groggy state she just thought it was. These are both speculations, of course, but I don't think that they're necessarily unfounded when we take everything else into consideration. Take, for example, the Lexus thing. It seems that she and her boyfriend only noticed the Lexus after the break-ins started, when they were already on high alert. As she explained, she'd just asked her boyfriend to scope out the parking lot before they left to see if there were any suspicious vehicles. Seeing a deeply tinted Lexus hanging out in your shitty apartment parking lot could certainly be perceived as odd, but I would argue the math changes if that Lexus belongs to your neighbor. Seeing it once in a while could suggest something shady, but in this case, we're just talking about her neighbor owning a nice car in a bad area, which could explain the tint. If you're worried about someone breaking into your vehicle to get at what's inside, you probably want to prevent people from seeing inside. And again, what about the license plate swap? Why would someone do that unless they were actively trying to evade being identified? Well, there's a couple of possible reasons. One is that the guy was up to something shady, but that could be anything from drug dealing to arms sales. The other is that he was replacing an old, damaged, or weathered plate with a new one, or he could have been installing a vanity plate. That wouldn't explain the part where Amy was seeing a silver Lexus following her, and that Lexus having different plates every time. But there's something else that would. It just wasn't the same Lexus. There are roughly 60,000 new Lexus sedans sold in the US every year, and I'm assuming this was a sedan, even though she doesn't actually say it was. And there's many more crossovers and SUVs sold. So like I said, she didn't say what kind of car it was beyond it being a silver Lexus, but we can assume there would be at least a couple dozen of them in any major US city. Silver is also a very popular color, specifically amongst luxury car brands, so it wouldn't be shocking if there were quite a few silver Lexus vehicles driving around Huntsville, which is a city of over 500,000 people. She also said that the plates were sometimes out of state, so that only adds to the potential number of similar cars being driven around the area. And, of course, there's the possibility that some of the cars she was seeing weren't even Lexus make to begin with. Acura, for example, has models that look incredibly similar to many Lexus vehicles. She also claimed that many of the times she saw the Lexus, it had temporary dealer plates, which I know she says they weren't local dealers, but also possible she wasn't familiar with every Lexus dealer, every car dealer that might sell a Lexus in the entire city of Huntsville. So it could be that she was just seeing people taking test drives. Or she could be seeing cars that were bought recently and just don't have the license plate yet, so they've still got the dealer plate and maybe they're from another city. Maybe somebody drove to Birmingham to get their, or Tuscaloosa to buy their Lexus, and now they're driving it back and they just don't have their permanent plate yet. On top of all of that, if the guy with the Lexus lived across the street from Amy and her boyfriend, then it's plausible that he shopped at many of the same local stores for essentials, which could explain why she saw it so often when going out to buy things like beer and groceries, as she said in the discussion. Lastly, we have the Uber situation. In urban areas, Uber is a popular side gig or even full-time job for many immigrants, and according to Amy, this guy was Eastern European. How does Uber assign drivers? By proximity to the request. So, if Amy's boyfriend requested an Uber from their house, and this guy was just starting his shift, he'd be the first person to receive the offer. Or at least, he'd be likely to be the first person to receive the offer. Does that sound like a hell of a coincidence? Sure, but it's also a very possible one. As for the lack of an Uber sticker, I mentioned previously that Uber doesn't have any real way of enforcing that unless riders report it. But on the other hand, it sounds like Amy didn't want to get anywhere near the vehicle, so there very well could have been one that she just didn't see. But what about the other two break-ins? The ones where someone cut a charging cable in half and unplugged a pair of headphones and went through the panty drawer. The latter seems easy enough, as it could be that the charger just wasn't plugged in properly when they left, or that it fell out. As for the cable, all we can really do is speculate on that one. But then again, I don't know that this part necessarily needs to be explained away. Frankly, the cable bit is weird. That does sound like someone breaking in and deliberately doing something to let you know they were there, but I don't think that some shadowy group of miscreants is the most likely culprit here, and for one particular reason. The panty drawer.
I guess you're gonna miss the panty raid.
If the burglar left her normal underwear alone while pulling out all of her delicates, that profiles not as an organized perpetrator making a threat against her, but as a stalker with an erotic or romantic fixation on Amy. Frankly, if you're trying to threaten someone in order to prevent them from doing a specific thing, then you're going to do something to make what that specific thing is clear. Unplugging her boyfriend's headphones, cutting a charging cable, and sifting through her panty drawer bear no clear connection to Amy's anti-gravity research. But they could be related to her being in a relationship with someone other than the perpetrator. This guy went through her panties. He unplugged the boyfriend's headphones. He cut a charging cable in half. That one I actually still don't get. But with all that in mind, we can construct a fairly reasonable hypothesis regarding the window issue, other than just, the boyfriend closed it, then opened it again, and Amy got confused. If Amy and her boyfriend left their windows unlocked, and we know that she left the house with the window open, so clearly they weren't all that concerned about security, that would grant someone an easy way in. Someone could have watched them each leave the house, climbed through the window, done whatever they were doing, then slipped back out before Amy returned, closing the window in the process out of habit. Is the whole thing creepy? Absolutely. And I would not be remotely surprised if someone actually was stalking Amy. She was an attractive woman with a big personality, and she easily could have drawn attention from any number of people she interacted with. That being said, I don't think there is a sound argument to be made in favor of the opinion that this was some sort of message from the bad guys trying to keep her from disclosing. I recognize that all of this analysis may seem overly skeptical, but there's a good reason for that. As the conversation progresses, and as Amy drinks more, her claims begin to seem less and less grounded in reality. For example, about an hour and 45 minutes in, she comes around to the issue of feeling like she has to be on her toes at all times. So if you talk to people in the know, like I talk to, she says, they will tell you that there is an estimated 5,000 foreign nation-state agents in Huntsville, Alabama. Now, given the nature of what's going on in Huntsville, that's actually not entirely unreasonable. But then she goes on to say that they're bartenders, they're oil mechanics, they're medical device salesmen, they work at a restaurant, they work at your doctor's office, and that their sole purpose is to go to the bar and sit there and listen to you talk while you're drunk. That's it, period. They will roofie you, they will threaten you, they will follow you. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. And yes, I agree that there are probably some spies doing those kinds of things. But please allow me to direct your attention to a few comments which occur even later in the recording. Just under 2 hours and 40 minutes in, Amy mentions that she's at her most productive when she's sitting by herself at a bar, having a beer with her headphones on and just plugging away. She can't do that anymore, however, because for the last 12 months, Keep in mind, this is May 2020. She's been having weird experiences. She claims to have been roofied multiple times and says that over the preceding year, if she sat down at a bar by herself, some 50-year-old dude would come and sit next to her, then turn to her and say, "Do you want 1 roofie in your drink or 2?" Then, presumably before she gets a chance to answer that question, he'll drop buzzwords that are relevant to her life. Amy also recalled that there had been at least 3 times when she felt like she had been more drunk than she should have been, based on how much she'd been drinking, and as soon as she'd begun to feel that way, all of a sudden, the bar around me are like, "What do you do for a living? Tell us, do you work for the government? What do you do? You're sitting there at your laptop. It looks cool." The point of all of this, of course, is 50% about collecting the intel and 50% is just straight up about intimidating you and making you feel scared. Again, it's possible that this stuff was actually happening to her and that people were actually drugging her and trying to draw information out in that vulnerable state. It's also possible that she was drinking too much, as we've seen her do throughout this discussion. She is hammered by the end of this recording. Additionally, the alcohol could have been interacting with her pain medication, and it could be that the people around her were just making small talk or maybe trying to strike up a conversation with an attractive woman. But honestly, I don't think that either of those options are what was really going on, and in fact, I don't know that I believe that any of it ever happened at all. Before I explain why, I want to lay out one last statement for you, because I think that all of this put together paints a very clear picture of what Amy was actually dealing with and how it may have led to her untimely death. Not long after the conversation about Amy getting drugged at the bar repeatedly while people question her about her job, Mark chimes in to say that Amy thinks she had boyfriends that were her handlers. She has concluded this to be the case for a few reasons, the most basic of which is that her relationships tend to last exactly 6 months before the handler breaks it off. Now keep in mind, this most recent relationship, she says she ended. The one where people were breaking in and they both had COVID and all of that. So that was one she ended. But she says that this 6-month protocol exists because if the handler stays in her life any longer, the relationship may begin to feel too real to them. And after that, they can't be trusted to continue working to control her. At first, they're telling you "I love you" and shit like that, and they're lying, she explains. But after 6 months, they're not lying anymore, and they're attached, and then they rotate them out. She came to believe she was being handled after she began to recognize some patterns in the behavior of her boyfriends, specifically in ways which differed from previous relationships. You can tell a handler from when they shut the fuck up because you talk to them about your crazy-ass life, she tells Mark and Jeremy. You're into some shit and you talk to them because they're your significant other. You talk to them about some shit and they talk back because they're faking. Every once in a while, though, Amy would mention something that her handler wasn't allowed to talk about, and then they just go quiet. That's how you can tell, she says, when they become silent and they just nod their head like "I can't say anything." That's a handler. Now, you may be wondering how the people running this scheme could ensure that Amy only ever dated the people they chose, and the answer is twofold. For one, they would offer her money to put towards her research, but only as a ruse to draw her in. It's a carrot on a stick, she explains, to engage you in conversation about your technology by offering you money that they had no intent on ever giving you. To ensure that Amy didn't clock the situation, they would see to it that the person they rotate in has existed in your life for at least 6 months to 12 months, meaning that by the time she entered a relationship with a new handler, the next one had already been in the pipeline for at least half a year. When the first handler's 6 months was up, he'd become a ghost, and the next one would swoop in to take advantage of her vulnerability, and then you rinse and repeat. Now, some people she'd told about this advised her to just roll with it, such as Dan Cooper, the katana-wielding, time-traveling, chess-playing super soldier, who told her to just date the handler. After all, as he put it, you have to date someone, and they're usually good in bed. Now, Amy says that she pushed back on Dan's argument there because, in her experience, the handlers were not, in fact, good in bed, something she attributed to their guilt over lying to her about the true nature of their relationship. As Amy put it, their don't work because they know they're right. Of course, we do know that this kind of thing happens, especially with the CIA and other foreign spy agencies. Honeypots do exist, and nobody is denying that. Congressman Eric Swalwell, for example, found that out the hard way a number of years back, and he probably wasn't the only one to fall into the trap. No pun intended. So why, in this case, am I so skeptical? Well, that would be because of who Amy says is behind all of it. This would be the kind of thing you might expect the FBI or NSA to set up, considering that this is a domestic issue. However, these are not the agencies Amy blames for manipulating her romantic life. Nor is it the CIA, MI6, or some other foreign intelligence agency like those of the Chinese or the Russians. No, according to her, and I quote, "The Freemasons have been sending me boyfriends. And not just any boyfriends, but boyfriends selected from the highest echelons of the organization." In one particular case, she says, quote, "I had this 33-degree White Knight of Malta, English and Scotch rights like super double Mason that pursued me and dated me for 6 months." For those of you who may not be aware, I myself am a Freemason, though one with a rather tepid relationship towards the fraternity at this point in my life. To be more specific, I am a 3rd-degree Master Mason and a Royal Archmason of the York Rite, and I have made a deliberate choice to steer clear of the Scottish Rite for reasons particular to my Anglican Catholic faith. I'll be putting out a video going into more detail on all of this in the near future, including the history of Freemasonry, how it came to exist in its current form, my concerns with said current form, and why I think the fraternity might be better served through significant reforms aimed at returning to our Catholic roots. See the Regius poem if you're confused about me referring to Freemasonry as Catholic. But that's not the point of this video. I'm only explaining all this in the hopes that those of you with hostile opinions towards Freemasons will listen to what I'm saying and understand that it's coming from a place of genuine honesty based on my studies of the organization over the last several years. I will swear that on my Catholicism. Ethan, the Bible. I swear I am telling you the truth, and I am not trying to mislead you. So with all of that said, I'd like to discuss this comment from Amy further because I think it's relevant to my ultimate point about what was going on inside of her head in the years leading up to her passing. I will tell you that I ran this up the chain and was told rather emphatically that we do not have a boyfriend distribution system. All jokes aside, however, I sincerely doubt that Amy was even dating a Freemason, let alone one assigned to her by the higher-ups, largely because we don't really have higher-ups, but more importantly because there's no way you could date a 33rd degree Mason for that long and get that many titles wrong. There is no White Knight of Malta, there is no English Rite, there is no such thing as a super double Mason, tongue-in-cheek as that may have been. And as for the whole no higher-ups thing, the way Freemasonry works is it's very decentralized. You've got your Grand Lodge that's usually at the state, provincial, or in the UK country level. We don't acknowledge anything on the European continent for the most part because they're weird. Continental Freemasonry is just basically not Freemasonry. Continental Freemasonry is to English American Freemasonry as Mormonism is to Catholicism. And also everything after 3rd degree is lateral. It's kind of like merit badges. It's like getting a merit badge doesn't make you higher than an Eagle Scout. You're just an Eagle Scout with more merit badges. So I don't want to get into the weeds of this because that's not the point, and again, I'm making another video on it. So the point here is that I really doubt that Amy was dating a Freemason, let alone a 33rd degree one. Instead, I offer an alternative hypothesis. As you can see from all of this, Amy does not appear to have had a good grip on reality. When you trace back her claims about men like Bill Dent and Ed Teller, you find that her beliefs originate not with documented evidence, but rather anecdotal claims made by people like Dan Cooper, who claimed to be time-traveling super soldiers. People like Frank Milburn, who didn't remotely push back when Amy claimed that the tops of her hands were somehow, in isolation, being targeted by directed energy weapons. People like Mark Sokol, who told her in this very same conversation that she has been destined to be the one who pulls the final string on anti-gravity. People who fed her paranoia and affirmed her delusions for their own personal gain, time and time again, for years on end. She allowed herself to be convinced that she was being roofied, stalked, and harassed by a cadre of spies who operated under the guise of anything from a bartender to a nurse to a mechanic. She worked herself into believing that her neighbor was following her everywhere and had somehow managed to get Uber to go along with it. She talked about a mysterious seventh force of nature involving portals. She believed she was being assigned handlers who posed as her boyfriend for years on end. She answered the question of whether or not she was an ultra-terrestrial by saying she didn't know, and at one point in the conversation, she said she wanted to do a Reddit AMA about her status as a time-traveling, world-saving, prophecy-fulfilling, and then says she's been in denial until about a month prior to the recording. And it doesn't sound like she's joking. Any of these things in isolation could be written off as a quirk or a joke. But when you put all of this stuff together, it starts to look like something else entirely. And I didn't even manage to cover the entire interview. Nor did I get to bring up things like the fact that the drug she was on, which was norepinephrine, I can't remember the actual drug name for it, is a drug that can be used to treat a nerve disease called erythromelalgia, which the reason I bring that up is that the tops of her hands, the rashes on the tops of her hands, they look like erythromelalgia. So those burns might have just been a rash caused by the very disease she was on medication for. There's also a bit in this interview about hackers trying to recruit her, and another segment about Mana World Holdings Trust and the anti-cabal that's actually a Russian mafia operation that decides if you're worth looking into, and if you are, they refer you to the operational groups. And somehow that all ties back to the Silver Lexus, because according to Amy, the operational groups are the ones that like move into the apartment across the parking lot from you and stalk you physically in your hometown. Like when you get referred from the gathering group to the operational group, it's really bad. End quote. And all of this is discussed with complete and total sincerity. I'm no psychiatrist, but if I had to take a wild guess, I wouldn't be remotely surprised if Amy, who was, I believe, 32 or 33 at the time of this conversation, was in the early stages of developing paranoid schizophrenia. I wonder how many of the conversations at the bar where people were asking all sorts of questions about her secrets were real. I wonder how many times she thought she was being followed because one of the whispering voices she mentioned told her to. I wonder how many of those boyfriends ghosted out on her because she accused them of being handlers. Most of all, I wonder if this could be the real reason she moved back home with her parents at the beginning of 2020. I wonder if the reason Richard's comments on her death have been so laconic is that he doesn't want people to think of his late daughter as crazy, that he wants them to remember her for her brilliance and not for the illness which may have taken it from her. As of right now, I do believe that the most likely explanation for Amy's death is that she experienced some kind of mental breakdown caused by the stress of believing she was being hunted because of her work, because everybody kept affirming that to her, and that she somehow concluded taking her life was the only way out. But at the same time, I do wonder how much of what Amy said in that recording might have been true. Things I didn't get to spend much time on in this episode, such as her claims that NASA will fund a project until they have a prototype, cancel the project, fire all the scientists, assign them to something else, and then proceed to have a team of other scientists work on maturing it further in secret. Things like Richard Eskridge's involvement in all of Amy's ventures, which appear to run much deeper than he's publicly acknowledged in the years following her death. I have to wonder, were Amy and her father actually onto something? And if they were, what was it? Obviously, I'm asking that question somewhat rhetorically, but if you in the comments have ideas, if you have worked in these fields, if you happen to have insider information, if there's any thoughts you have whatsoever, please comment. Tell me what you're thinking. If you don't feel comfortable commenting, shoot me an email at thelorelodge@gmail.com. That's the big catch-all email address. And while, I'm a little uncertain about everything involved here, I do not think this is connected to the other missing scientists. Partially because we ruled out like 6 or 7 of them as being weird in the first place in that other video. Ethan just did the 6-7 thing at me. But the main reason that I don't think this is connected is because Amy was not working for the government. Amy was not a NASA scientist. Amy was not working for Los Alamos. She was not working for JPL. The ones that have a potential for being weird and being connected, there's just not enough connective tissue with Amy in particular. So I think that whatever happened with Amy, it was probably an isolated case. Just like whatever happened with Ning Lee was likely an isolated case. And the one thing that I think could change my mind about that is what my research about Joshua LeBlanc uncovers. Because his death definitely seems weird. His Tesla was sitting at an airport for 4 hours, and then suddenly he drove off away from Huntsville and crashed, and the Tesla burned, and they had to identify the body through dental records, and nobody can seem to explain why any of that happened, and red tape has been holding up getting the actual footage and data about what the Tesla was doing, back to the family. So I think if there's something connecting that to Amy, then I'll revisit. But for now, my opinion on it is that Amy is probably just a tragic case of somebody who was deeply, deeply mentally ill and probably getting worse in the moments leading up to her death. But like I said, if you have other thoughts, if you think there's something I missed, if you think there's connections somewhere, please do comment them. And, if you like this video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, join our Discord, because that's where you will get the most timely notifications for everything we do, not just on this channel, but also on The Lore Lads, History Unhinged, Weird Bible, which has a new episode coming out. It might already be out by the time this video goes up. Maybe? Maybe not. I don't know. Well, it'll be out soon. We've also got Silver Retention. We've got the Land Lodge, or the Land Lads, one of the two. I'll fix the link to that so that it's proper in the description. But that's a game streaming channel. We've got Silver Retention, which is Aiden Thornbury, and now they have a podcast that Ethan's also on. So we've got a whole bunch of projects going on right now. All of this is part of our general redacted media network that we own and we run. So if you're ever looking for more Lodge, that's where you go. Oh, and the Discord is linked in the description. You know what else is linked in the description? Bunker Branding, where you can get Lore Lodge merch, and also Tableau Roasting Company, where you can get our coffee, but not right now, because there's been some supply chain issues. So we're working on getting that fixed. Of course, you can also subscribe on Patreon or on Pepperbox to get ad-free episodes, and I think that just about does it. Yeah, I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.